"My ribs are already broken," she whispered. But he held her through the pain. The wind rolled down from the hills like a silent judge, carrying dust through the narrow streets of Dry Willow. It was Sunday noon, and the townsfolk had just stepped out of the small church that sat crooked at the edge of town. Bells still echoed when the whispers began. At the base of the steps stood a woman with a torn shawl and a face pale from the bruises not yet healed. Her name was Clara. She hadn't said a word since returning, not even when the preacher hesitated before shaking her hand. A few folks looked away. Others didn't bother hiding their stares. "She should have stayed gone," murmured Mrs. Whitmore, loud enough for others to hear. "Coming back without a husband or child, dragging shame like a stray dog." Clara didn't flinch. She stood in the sun, hands clasped tight, eyes fixed on nothing. Her dress was the same she'd worn 2 years ago when she left this town as a married woman. Now it hung loose on her frame, her ribs showing like frail beams of a house too long abandoned. No one offered her a ride, no one walked beside her. As the last hymn faded, she stepped off the church steps alone, her boots silent against the gravel. A child tugged at his mother's skirt and pointed. She was pulled away quickly. Behind Clara, the doors of the church closed. Ahead, the main street stretched bare and hot. Somewhere beyond the dust and the stairs, she hoped there was still a place where a woman with nothing left could be seen again. Not pitied, not mocked, just seen. Clara had once been known for her laughter. It was the kind that floated through windows while cooking stew or sewing in the late light of day. Back then she lived just outside town with her husband Samuel, in a cabin lined with wild roses. People said she brought color to that house, like spring blooming after a long winter. Cha. But Samuel had a temper, the kind that started as silence and grew into storms. When Clara miscarried for the second time, he stopped calling her by name. By the third time, he stopped coming home sober. One evening, when the air was thick with heat and resentment, he left without a word. She waited 5 days before realizing he would not return. Rumors spread quickly in Dry Willow. Some said she'd driven him away. Others whispered that she had failed as a wife, as a woman. No one asked Clara what happened. No one came knocking. She left under the cover of night, bruised and bleeding, with only a satchel and the will to survive. The journey out west had been brutal. She found odd work in distant towns, cleaning, nursing, hiding behind curtains where no one asked questions. Yet everywhere she went, she carried the same shame, the same ache in her side, the same silence. Now, 2 years later, she had returned not because she believed she was welcome, but because her ribs still throbbed with old pain and her heart no longer knew where else to go. The world was not built for women like her, women who had been loved badly, used poorly, and still stood upright. Each morning since her return, she woke before dawn and walked past the stables, past the bakery, past the judgment in people's eyes. She didn't look back. Her hands were still strong. Her eyes still watched everything, quiet and careful. Her ribs, though broken once by force, were healing not just from the inside, but with every step she took alone through a town that had forgotten her worth. He was a man known for his silence, but not the kind that made people uneasy. James Callahan spoke with his eyes more than his mouth, and when he did speak, it was never wasted breath. Folks called him steady, like the horses he raised just north of town, strong, calm, and unshaken by storms. James had seen Clara the morning shower. He returned. Not because he was looking, but because he noticed things others chose to ignore. He had been tying a saddle near the hitching post outside the general store when she passed by, clutching her shawl like it was the last piece of her dignity. He hadn't stared, hadn't whispered. He had simply tipped his hat, just once, the way he did when a thundercloud passed overhead, acknowledging the weight without asking for an explanation. In the days that followed, James found himself watching her more than he meant to. She moved like someone who expected to be struck by words, or worse, but kept walking anyway. There was something about the way she carried herself, shoulders tucked in, but eyes still searching, that stirred something he couldn't name. James wasn't a man who rushed toward trouble, but neither did he turn away from it. He had lost things too, his brother in the war, his mother to fever, and a woman once who could not bear the quiet of his heart. But his land was still his, and his word still good. That week, he rode into town twice more than usual, not for feed or lumber, but for the chance to see her walk past the well with her empty bucket. He didn't offer to carry it. He didn't ask her what had happened. But on Thursday, as the clouds gathered over the hills and townsfolk hurried to finish their errands, he stepped out of the blacksmith's and saw her struggling with a torn bag of flour. She didn't ask for help. Still, he crossed the road, lifted the sack without a word, and walked beside her down the path. Not pity, not charity, just presence. And for the first time in a long while, Clara didn't walk alone. The next morning, Clara stepped onto her small porch and found a bundle resting against the worn wooden rail. Wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, it wasn't grand or showy, just simple and quiet, like the man who had left it. She opened it with slow fingers. Inside were a pair of worn but sturdy leather gloves, men's gloves, trimmed down to fit smaller hands. The lining was soft. The cuffs had been sewn tighter, clumsily, but with care. S. Note was tucked inside, just 3 words, written in a hand rough as bark. If you're willing. No name, no explanation, but she knew. That afternoon, Clara walked the 3 miles north to the Callahan ranch. She didn't say a word when she arrived, only held up the gloves and waited. James, loading fence posts onto a wagon, looked at her and gave the faintest nod, as though she'd answered a question he never asked aloud. He gave her no task she couldn't handle. She swept the barn, fed the chickens, gathered firewood. Each job was clear, and each one finished brought a small nod of approval. Not praise, not smiles, just a kind of silent agreement that she had done enough. There was no chattering, no questions about her past. James offered water when the sun rose high, and she took it wordlessly. When her fingers blistered, he handed her salve without looking away from the fence he was mending. She wore the gloves every day. At dusk, when she left, he always walked her to the edge of the path and tipped his hat. Not once did he offer to ride her home. He knew better. He knew she needed to walk on her own legs a while longer. But Clara noticed the way he always watched until she disappeared around the bend, and James noticed how she began walking slower at the end of each day. It was not love, not yet, but it was something stronger than kindness. It was respect. And respect, once planted in good soil, does not stay small for long. Clara had never worked a full day on a ranch before. Not like this. The sun came early on the Callahan land. Her first chore was to milk a cow that clearly knew she was afraid. The bucket kicked over twice. Her skirt was soaked, her face red. She muttered apologies to no one and started again. James had watched from a distance. He didn't correct her, didn't sigh or step in. When she finally managed half a bucket, he gave a single nod and went back to splitting wood. Each day the tasks grew, clearing the chicken coop, mending the herb garden fence, carrying water from the pump. Her back ached in places she didn't know had muscle. Her hands, even under the gloves, blistered and bled. Once, when she dropped a basket of eggs, she froze. The sound of shells cracking on the kitchen floor took her straight back to a different kind of silence, one filled with anger, not patience. She waited for shouting, for something sharp. But James only crouched beside her, picked up a broken shell and said softly, "We've got more hens." She looked at him then, really looked, and something inside her chest loosened, just a little. In the evenings, he would leave things on the porch, a jar of liniment, a clean kerchief, a folded note with a sketched map of the ranch, marking places where wild berries grew. Clara never thanked him with words, but she began to leave her boots beside his fence when she came early, and once she brought him cornbread wrapped in cloth, left without a name. One day, she tried saddling a mare herself and cinched the strap too tight. The horse kicked and spooked. Clara fell hard onto the dirt, her breath knocked clean from her lungs. She curled up, holding her side. For a moment, her ribs screamed with memory. James was beside her in seconds, not panicked, not loud, just steady. He helped her sit, one arm behind her back, his hand firm on her shoulder. "You're all right," he said quietly. "You're all right." She nodded, even though tears streamed down her face. They sat there on the barn floor for a long time. No more words passed between them. But something had changed. He didn't reach to fix her, and she didn't pull away. In that quiet, Clara realized something unfamiliar was growing between them. Not duty, not rescue, trust. And trust, once born, does not forget the hands that helped carry it. It was on a warm Saturday afternoon that the child came, small, wild-haired, and barefoot. James had agreed to watch his sister's boy, Eli, for the weekend, while she traveled to care for their aging father. Clara had just finished hanging wet linens on the line when the boy ran up to her with a stick in one hand and dust on his cheeks. He stared at her like children do, curious and unafraid. Clara gave a small smile and offered him a cloth to wipe his nose. "You live here?" he asked. She hesitated. "Just work here." He frowned. "You clean stuff?" She nodded. "Then you're the mama of the house." The words landed like thunder in her chest. She stood frozen, the cloth still in her hand. Her breath caught in her throat as the boy scampered off again, chasing a chicken with loud, joyous shrieks. He had meant nothing by it, no weight, no cruelty, just a child's way of naming what he saw. But Clara sat down on the porch step, hands trembling. Mama. It had been years since she'd heard that word spoken near her. Years since she lost the tiny life she once carried. Years since Samuel had thrown blame like stones, and the town had buried her in silence. And here came this boy, wild and innocent, handing her back a piece of herself she thought long gone. She didn't cry right then. Not until evening, when Eli fell asleep on a blanket near the fire, and James returned from the barn, brushing hay off his sleeves. He found Clara sitting by the hearth, staring into the flames, her hands clenched in her lap. When he sat beside her, she finally whispered, "He called me Mama." James didn't speak. He only reached over, not to fix, not to explain, just to rest his hand on top of hers. And she let it stay. The wind changed on Monday. Clara felt it before she saw him. That weight in the air, that pressure behind the eyes. It had been over 2 years, but some shadows do not stay buried. Samuel rode into town just after midday, swaggering like nothing had changed. He looked leaner, meaner. His eyes scanned the streets of Dry Willow like a man looking to reclaim what was his. A few men greeted him with forced smiles. Others looked away. Clara had come to the market for flour unaware. She stepped out of the general store, basket in hand, and stopped cold. He stood across the street near the live, his boots dusty and his coat flapping in the wind. When their eyes met, he grinned. "Well, I'll be," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "if it ain't my broken wife." Conversations around them fell quiet. The blacksmith paused, mid-hammer. A young girl dropped her apple. Clara did not run. Not this time. She tightened her grip on the basket, feeling the sharp edges of the wood dig into her palm. Her ribs ached with old memory, but she stood tall. Samuel took a few steps toward her. "You think you can come back here and pretend you ain't still mine?" And then a voice behind her, steady and low. "She's not yours." James stepped forward from the far side of the street, his stride slow but unshaken. He came to stand beside Clara, not in front of her. Samuel laughed. "Oh, the rancher! You think she's yours now? You think you can save her?" Clara stepped forward before James could reply. Her voice, though soft, carried, "No one owns me, not anymore." Samuel's smirk faltered. "I buried your name the day you left me bleeding in that house," she said, louder now. The crack in her voice, not weakness, but release. "I survived without your kindness. I survived without your name." The crowd stared in stunned silence. Samuel took one last look at her, eyes narrow, jaw tight. He turned without another word, spat into the dirt, and walked away. James did not touch her, did not speak. He just stood there, beside her, while the town held its breath. And for the first time in her life, Clara realized she hadn't just endured. She had become unbreakable. The storm came fast and without warning. By late afternoon, the sky over Dry Willow had turned a strange copper green. Winds picked up, scattering dust and leaves through the trees. Clara had just finished bringing in laundry from the line when she heard the scream. It came from the lower pasture. Eli. She didn't hesitate. Droppies, and the basket she ran, boots thudding through the tall grass. Down the slope, the boy clung to the side of a spooked mare, one foot caught in the stirrup, the reins dragging in the dirt. The horse bucked, wild-eyed, panicked by the oncoming thunder. "Let go, Eli!" Clara shouted, racing toward him. He couldn't. The stirrup held him fast. Without thinking, Clara grabbed at the bridle. The horse reared, nearly striking her. But she didn't back down. She held fast, speaking soft and low despite the pounding in her chest. "It's all right, girl. It's all right. You're safe. He's safe." The mare jolted again, dragging Clara a few feet through the mud. Her shoulder slammed hard against the ground. Pain flared in her side. Then came James. He arrived like a force of nature, sure-footed, eyes locked on the horse. In a single move, he seized the reins and calmed the mare with a deep, firm command. She slowed, snorted, then stilled. Clara rolled to her knees, gasping. James knelt beside her, checking her side. "Your ribs." "They were already broken," she whispered through a grimace. "You know that." He almost smiled. Almost. Eli, shaken but unharmed, was pulled free and clung to Clara's neck. She held him tightly, pressing his small body to her chest as the rain began to fall. The three of them stood together beneath the growing storm, soaked, breathless, hearts pounding. Not just saved, but tethered now. Not by crisis, by choice. By the next morning, the story had traveled faster than the storm. People in Dry Willow spoke of the runaway horse and how Clara had thrown herself in harm's way to save the boy. They spoke of her strength, her calm, her fearlessness. The same voices that once whispered behind her back now fell silent when she passed. Only this time, not out of shame. Out of respect. At the bakery, Mrs. Whitmore placed an extra loaf into Clara's basket without a word. At the blacksmith's, old Tom tipped his hat with a solemn nod. Children no longer turned their heads away when she walked by. They watched her with quiet curiosity, as if seeing her for the first time. Later that week, at Sunday service, Clara entered the church alone. But this time, no one moved aside. James stood near the back, his arms folded loosely, his hat tucked under one arm. When she entered, he straightened, his gaze soft but steady, and the space between them no longer felt like silence. It felt like understanding. As she walked down the aisle, heads turned, not to judge, but to witness. The preacher's voice faltered before he welcomed her in the opening prayer. And when she sat in the fourth pew, right where she used to sit beside Samuel, no one dared fill the space beside her. They didn't need to. She had already filled it, with grace, with strength, with quiet survival. And for the first time in Dry Willow, Clara was not the subject of whispers. She was the reason they fell quiet. It was a quiet evening when James asked her to walk with him. The chores were done, the sun had sunk low behind the ridge, and the sky turned the soft color of ashes and rose. They didn't speak at first, only walked along the fence line, boots brushing the tall grass. James stopped beneath the oak tree near the creek, the same one where she had once dropped firewood, and he had picked it up without a word. Now, he turned to face her. "I reckon you already know," he said, voice low and steady. "But I want to say it plain." Clara looked up, eyes calm, waiting. "I don't pity you, Clara," he said. "Never have. I've watched the way you carry weight without asking for help. The way you keep going when it would have been easier to turn back. You've got more strength in you than most men I've ever known." She blinked, but said nothing. "I care for you," he said simply. "Not because I should. Because I do." Then, from his coat pocket, he pulled out a small hand-carved wooden box, rough, unfinished, but shaped with care. Inside it lay a brooch made of wild rosewood, smooth, oval, with a precale, said "Forget-me-not," inside glass. "I made it for you. You don't owe me anything. But if you want to stay, not just on the ranch, but with me, I'd be honored." Clara took the box with both hands. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced the curve of the wood, the small blue flower preserved inside. "I've never been someone's first choice," she whispered. "You were mine," he replied, without hesitation. She looked up at him, then stepped forward and placed the brooch gently over her heart. It was not grand, not loud, but it was the kind of yes that would echo for years. Clara never left Dry Willow again. She stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had finally found what no other place had given her: quiet belonging. In the years that followed, her name was no longer spoken in hushed tones. It was called across fields, written on letters, and spoken gently by a child she would one day help raise. The brooch never left her dress. The house she once feared to enter became her home, and the man who once stood beside her in silence became the one who held her through every storm, every soft morning, every long and ordinary day. They did not build a life out of grand gestures. They built it out of small, steady ones: firewood stacked, fences mended, hands held after nightfall. Because sometimes healing is not loud. It's patient. Love doesn't shout. It waits, heals, and stays. And in the softest corner of that quiet town, under a weathered oak, two hearts learned that broken things do not stay broken when held with care.